The federal government's declaration of a public order emergency comes with powerful new measures. As of last night, Canadian banks can temporarily cease providing financial services when an account is suspected of being used to further the blockades and the occupations. They can now also immediately freeze or suspend an account without a court order. So what impact will these measures have, and is a dangerous precedent maybe being set? Jessica Davis is the president of Insight Threat Intelligence. She's also a former CSIS senior strategic analyst, and she is in Kingston, Ontario. Jessica Davis, thanks for joining us again.
Hi, David. Thanks for having me on.
You've looked at these measures. How effective do you think these can be in ending what's going on?
The effectiveness of the measures is, I think, subject to a fair bit of debate at the moment. So in the short term, I think these measures won't have an immediate impact on the occupation, particularly in Ottawa. That's extremely well resourced. There's tons of logistics and supplies still in situ in Ottawa. So short-term, freezing or seizing funds associated with the convoy isn't likely to have an immediate impact. Over the medium term, I would say that this is probably more likely to put a lot of financial pressure on the people who are participating in the protest. They're not going to be able to do things like pay bills, pay their hotel bills. They'll eventually run out of supplies as well. And then the longer term implications are, I think, something that are much more difficult to predict and probably a little bit more dangerous too.
Yeah, we'll go bit by bit. So what does it potentially mean for individuals and organizers of the protest, right? You heard the Deputy Prime Minister last night saying to the truck owners, we're going to freeze your corporate accounts and we're going to strip your insurance. I mean, if you're not insured, you can't drive. If you can't get your money, you can't pay your truck. I mean, that puts you at a real risk of losing your most valuable possession potentially.
Yeah, and the majority of these measures are really targeting the accounts of the individuals and the companies involved or associated with the protest. So one of the key pieces is that anybody who's associated or furthering the protest or the occupation here in Ottawa, their accounts can be frozen and their funds seized by banks. Now, this isn't necessarily going to happen. There's a bit of difficulty in terms of the nuance of the language. We'll get a bit more clarification when the regulations come out, but it gives the banks an awful lot of power on that front. They can also prevent financial transactions in the accounts of the individuals who are involved. So this means things like paying those bills, paying potentially rent, any kind of day-to-day financial transactions could be stopped if these individuals have been identified as being part of the protest movement.
Right, so the leaders who have been quite public and self-identified and issued statements and held news releases, or held news conferences, I mean, you used a phrase last night on Twitter about they could be debanked. I mean, does that essentially mean you lose access to all your accounts? You can't do business with a Canadian bank because of this?
Yeah, that'll be a temporary measure, but that'll be the effect in terms of short-term impacts. It'll basically mean that they're not going to be able to take money out of an ATM, do any of these kinds of things. And as you mentioned, a lot of the organizers and actually a lot of the people in this protest have been very visible publicly. So the banks aren't going to have a hard time identifying who this is. And there are also corporate entities that have been created to support the movement. So there was a nonprofit organization that's been created. That's going to have these measures will have an immediate impact on any sort of financial activity for that. So withdrawing funds, transferring funds, emailing money, that kind of thing.
You know, you mentioned long-term impacts. This is obviously announced. These are time-limited measures to deal with the situation right now. But there's often unintended consequences when the hammer gets dropped in a legal framework. I mean, what concerns do you have about the long-term effects of something like this?
There are a couple of things here. I think the long-term effects, this protest to a certain extent is spurred by this idea of government overreach. And to be fair, this is a significant step by the government in terms of freezing people's access to financial services, which some will interpret it as further evidence of that overreach. It could have the effect of sort of entrenching their ideas and their mindset, and could, in fact, further radicalize them in the cause. I think longer term, sort of in the 30-day window, this will probably have the effect of limiting their ability to continue the occupation, which is the intended effect. But there may be some people who are really entrenched, both physically and in their ideas, that it still may be difficult to get them out of the downtown core.
What about the precedent this sets, right? This is being used to deal with critical infrastructure, to deal with the capital city. But I mean, could a future government use measures like this to deal with, say, a pipeline being blockaded or railways being stopped or that kind of thing?
That's definitely a concern. I think at the moment, this is it's quite an unprecedented situation. I've never seen anything like it in my time. So I think that while there are concerns about that, and I think those concerns are legitimate and fair, there's also a process here that we're going to have an after action review to potentially create different laws that are maybe less extreme and to maybe put some limits on that. But in terms of some of the unintended consequences too, I think it's important to note that, a lot of the people who are attending this protest have family members, are paying bills, potentially paying child support, and all of those things can be directly impacted by some of these measures. So they're not just going to affect the people who are being directly targeted by them, but some of the people on their periphery, in particularly things like corporate accounts. If there's a business involved, are they going to be able to pay their employees? These are open questions, and I think that the answer is probably it's going to be very difficult for them.
Yeah, the knock-on effect could be really significant. Jessica Davis, thank you so much for your time tonight.
Thanks so much.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.